Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022. More U.S. sanctions on Russia in response to its military actions in and around Ukraine. President Joe Biden going after the company building the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that runs between Russia and Germany. European Union will soon be out with a plan to end its reliance on Russia for energy supplies. We'll talk about that with Washington Post reporter Michael Birnbaum. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has a problem with Russian President Vladimir Putin, calling the military forces that Putin is unilaterally sending into eastern Ukraine peacekeepers, a term with a long history and specific definition in the international arena. Across the United States, tractor-trailer convoys setting out for the Washington, D.C. metro area. The goal, causing gridlock on the roads to protest COVID-19 restrictions, including vaccine and mask mandates. We'll hear from an organizer of one of the convoys in California, also from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and from the Pentagon press secretary about security preparations, including deploying the National Guard. And the Supreme Court hears oral argument in a case involving former President Trump's public charge rule to allow potential immigrants to the U.S. to be turned away if they're likely to get public benefits. The issue before the court is whether Republican-led states can defend the rule in court when the Democratic Biden administration does not want to. A story from the LA Times. As Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration Wednesday added to its economic sanctions package targeting Moscow by allowing previously blocked sanctions to take effect against the company behind the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Announcing the sanctions in the statement, President Biden emphasized that the U.S. will not hesitate to take further steps as Russia continues to escalate. At today's State Department briefing, spokesman Ned Price questioned by Associated Press reporter Matt Lee about the reasoning the Biden administration gave for initially waiving the sanctions on Nord Stream 2.
You guys have been saying for months, indeed for over a year since the waivers were first granted, that in fact this gave you additional leverage, withholding the sanctions did, and would serve as a deterrent. Clearly, it didn't. They didn't provide you with any leverage at all that we can tell, because of what you just said in your opening statement about the invasion beginning. So, how do you explain to people why you didn't impose these sanctions earlier?
So, Matt, it's important, and let's just rewind the tape and remember what has happened in recent hours. Yesterday, within a short time frame of the Russian invasion beginning, Germany took decisive, resolute action to take Nord Stream 2 off the table. Today, we followed with our own complementary authorities using the powers and capabilities that we have. We have always said, in the context of Nord Stream 2, in the context of the steps that we are taking with partners and allies around the world, that one of the most important tools we have in our arsenal is transatlantic unity. The fact that Germany acted so quickly, so decisively, is in many ways a product of the coordination, of the consultation we have done now with two successive German governments. Of course, it started with Chancellor Merkel and her government, and in more recent months, we have had concerted discussions with Chancellor Scholz and his government. The fact that we are acting in unison immediately to take these steps that essentially remove Nord Stream 2 from the equation, that is a byproduct, that is a result of the work that we have done together with the German government over the course of these last several months, over the course of the last year or so.
So it sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that your argument is that if you had imposed the sanctions earlier, the Germans wouldn't have the Germans wouldn't have done what they did yesterday, or it would have been a much bigger lift to get them to do that.
What we have said, and our strategy has been predicated on the knowledge that transatlantic unity is the most powerful instrument we have.
State Department spokesman Ned Price being questioned by Matt Lee, a diplomatic writer with the Associated Press, during today's State Department briefing. A few more developments in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs warning that in response to U.S. sanctions, quote, there should be no doubt that sanctions will receive a strong response, not necessarily symmetrical, but finely tuned and painful to the American side. Also, Ukraine issuing a state of emergency and beginning to conscript reservists into the military. Ages 18 to 60 are eligible. Russia beginning to evacuate its embassy in Kyiv, and Ukraine urging its citizens to leave Russia. All of fears that further Russia invasion of Ukraine may happen at any time. Also, the RBC Ukraine news agency reporting today that several government websites in Ukraine were targeted in a new cyber attack. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi back from the Munich Security Conference in Germany. She led a delegation there holding her first news conference on Capitol Hill. House and Senate not in session this week. Pelosi calling Russian President Putin a tyrant.
It's stunning to see in this day and age a tyrant roll into a country. This is the same tyrant who attacked our democracy in 2016. This is the same tyrant who is opposed to democracy and wants to trivialize it, to downgrade it in the eyes of the Russian people.
That's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, a news conference on Capitol Hill today. After President Biden announced sanctions against Russia, the bulk of them on Tuesday in coordination with Canada and European allies, targeting Russian oligarchs, banks, and sovereign debt, that in response to Russia's recognizing the two new independent countries carved out of East Ukraine and ordering the Russian military in to, quote, keep the peace. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy tweeting, Vladimir Putin's decision to launch a renewed invasion of Ukraine is reprehensible. Sadly, President Biden consistently chose appeasement, and his tough talk on Russia was never followed by strong action. Today, House Speaker Pelosi defending President Biden. You're also going to hear, joining the speaker, Democratic Congresswoman Barbara Lee, also from California, who answers a question about congressional war powers.
Do you think the president's sanctions went far enough? Because at the outset, there were some, even his closest allies, that felt that he could have issued harsher sanctions. Senator Chris Coons comes to mind. And then following up on that, there's a group of lawmakers from both sides of the aisle that are calling on the president to respect Congress's war authorities. Do you support that as well?
I certainly support that, but I don't think those two things are related. The fact is the President of the United States, by executive order, has the power to exercise impose the sanctions. We understand this. We are not in this alone. The beauty of it all is that it is a unified effort of our NATO allies, of which and of course, U.S. and Canada from this side of the Atlantic and on the others. The steps that the president is taking are appropriate. The Europeans feel the pain more than we do of sanctions. It is not without any collateral impact in their countries. When you do what we heard from the, shall we say, the head of the EU, the president of the EU Commission, was that they're into diversification in terms of their energy, meeting their energy needs and the rest, so they're not as dependent. But it will have an impact in the beginning. I think the president has full knowledge of what impact these sanctions will have and is fully ready to go all the way with it. And that's something that we have done together. I'm going to have Barbara Lee speak about the authorization of the use of military force, because this is something she's been a champion on for her entire service in the Congress. That's a different subject than as to whether the president can impose sanctions as to whether we can go to war. Barbara? Excuse me.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, I did sign the letter that Congressman Peter DeFazio was one of the leaders in that. And in fact, the President has indicated over and over and over again that in no way does he intend to allow or insert ground troops in this. With the increase in tensions, we signed the letter and wrote the letter because we want to make sure that the War Powers Act is complied with, and that the public understands that the president means what he says, because he's not going to insert ground troops into this possible incursion.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee joining House Speaker Nancy Pelosi at a news conference in Washington. Also there, two other members of Congress, Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell, all of them from California. TheHill.com reports that one camp of Republican traditionalists, represented by Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming, have pressed hard to counter Putin's authoritarian instincts with tough new sanctions, more defense spending for Kyiv, and a robust show of U.S. military might in the allied countries of Eastern Europe. Graham saying at a press conference on Tuesday, I want a sanctions regime from hell. But an opposing wing embodied by former President Trump and his closest followers, pushing for a much more isolationist agenda, arguing the U.S. has for too long suffered the cost of playing policeman to the world. I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another, said J.D. Vance, the author vying for a Senate seat and Trump's endorsement in Ohio. You can read that story at thehill.com. In Great Britain, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announcing his country will provide more military support to Ukraine, including defense weapons. And also the British media regulator will investigate whether action should be taken against the Russian news channel RT for spreading, according to the British Culture Secretary, harmful disinformation about the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But Prime Minister Johnson, who leads the Conservative Party, questioned during Prime Minister's Question Time today about the sanctions he imposed on Tuesday and whether they went far enough. Here is Keir Starmer. He leads the Labour Party.
Mr. Speaker, we all want to deter aggression in Europe. We're not dealing with breakaway republics. Putin is not a peacekeeper. A sovereign nation has been invaded. The Prime Minister promised that in the event of an invasion, he would unleash a full package of sanctions. If not now, then when?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, the UK has been out in front in offering military support to Ukraine, and I'm grateful for what he said yesterday about the need to make sure that we keep ammunition in reserve for what could be a protracted struggle over this issue. But there has been in no doubt about the extent of the package that has already been set out yesterday and what we are already doing. Because, Mr. Speaker, I don't think people quite realise that the UK is out in front. We've sanctioned 275 individuals already. Yesterday we announced measures that place banks worth £37 billion under sanctions in addition to more oligarchs. And, Mr. Speaker, there is more to come. And we will be stopping Russia. We will be stopping Russia from raising sovereign debt, stopping Russian companies from raising money, and stopping Russian companies, as I said yesterday, even clearing in sterling and dollars on international markets, Mr. Speaker. That will hit Putin where it hurts, but it is absolutely vital that after this first barrage, we work in lockstep with friends and allies around the world. And we squeeze him simultaneously. We squeeze him simultaneously in London, in Paris, in New York at the same time. Unity, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely vital.
I hear what the Prime Minister says about sequencing and about further sanctions. But there's already been an invasion. And there's clearly concern across the House that his strategy, I accept unintentionally, could send the wrong message. So if the Prime Minister now brings forward his full package of sanctions, excluding Russia from financial mechanisms like SWIFT and a ban on trading in Russian sovereign debt, he will have the full support of the House. Will he do so?
I'm grateful. Mr. Speaker, I think yesterday, and I'm grateful, by the way, for the general support that the opposition have given, not just to our economic sanctions, but also to the package of military support, which will, as I've said, intensify. What we want to see, Mr. Speaker, is de-escalation by Vladimir Putin. There's still hope that he will see sense, but we are ready very rapidly to escalate our sanctions as I have set out. and under the measures that this House has already approved, and that we can now target, Mr. Speaker, any Russian entity, any Russian individual. We can already target not just the breakaway republics, the so-called breakaway republics in the Oblast of Donetsk and Lugansk. We can target members of the Duma who voted to recognize them. This is the most far-reaching piece of legislation of its kind, and I'm glad that it has his support.
Prime Minister's Question Time in the British House of Commons. Prime Minister Boris Johnson questioned by Labour leader Keir Starmer. A headline at The Washington Post: EU will unveil a strategy to break free from Russian gas after decades of dependence. The subhead reads, Ukraine crisis has pushed Europe towards renewables, but will the change come quickly enough? Joining us now to talk about it is the reporter on that story, Washington Post climate solutions reporter Michael Birnbaum. Thank you very much for being here. Before we get to the strategy from the EU, how dependent now is Europe on Russia for energy supplies?
It is quite dependent. It is dependent enough that it would be painful if it were cut off tomorrow from Russian energy. The EU currently imports about 40% of the natural gas it uses from Russia. So that's a pretty big chunk.
Do we have any details about the upcoming strategy and if the plans, how long they'll take, will it be complicated, will it be expensive?
Yeah, so it is complicated. The background here is that the European Union, especially Germany, has for decades been buying lots and lots of Russian natural gas. That's something that started even back in the Soviet Union. It was a strategy by Germany's leaders back in the late 60s and early 70s to build economic ties to the Soviet Union and try to achieve some sort of political stability through economic trade. And that has led to, in recent years, Europe feeling pretty held back when Russia has behaved badly on the international stage. That meant that back in 2014, when Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and then helped foment the separatist insurgency, the EU sanctions were pretty minor. They were pretty muted, partly because they were so concerned about what would happen if Russia cut off gas supplies. So what's happening now, the European Union is saying in a lot of ways, enough is enough. We need to move away from Russia. We can't be so dependent. And they're saying that they can do it through investing heavily in renewable energy. France wants to build more nuclear power plants, doing a lot of the things that they've actually already said that they were going to do for climate reasons. They're just saying now they need to do it faster so that they don't need Russian gas as much as they used to. But it is going to take a bunch of years. They can't sort this out overnight. And kind of the earliest that anybody is hoping for real independence is in the late 2020s, maybe 2028, maybe 2030.
What might the plans in Europe mean for the United States? Energy prices and supply here, would it have any effect?
Well, I guess there are a couple factors at play. One is that Europe is increasingly, in the short run, over the next couple of years, very interested in American natural gas, which it would be importing through a very complicated process, but basically you cool the gas down, turns into a liquid. You can put it on a ship and sail it over to Europe. Normally, gas is a gas. You need to send it through a pipeline. So that is an increasing market for the United States. It's a new customer, and Europe wants to replace some of the Russian gas with American gas. It would be buying less gas from Russia. That would mean that theoretically, there would be more gas on the world market, and so I suppose that could potentially, drop prices a bit. But in the short run, geopolitical conflict is, especially with a major fossil fuel producer, oil and gas producer, Russia, that's never good for energy prices. And you can see in the statements of President Biden and other top White House officials in recent days, they're sort of laying the groundwork. They're bracing for impact, and they're warning Americans to get ready to feel the bite of potentially increased energy prices in the coming weeks and months.
We're talking with Michael Birnbaum from the Washington Post. Do you know what's happening now with energy supplies running from Russia through Ukraine to Germany as this military tension standoff is happening? Are those supplies being affected now? Are they being curtailed in any way?
They are not being curtailed because of the military tensions. What we've seen over the last couple of months, and part of what is spurring the European Union into action right now, saying that they need to be less dependent on Russia, is that Russia is supplying kind of the bare minimum of gas to Europe. It has these long-term contracts, and it's been meeting those contracts, but Europe typically buys about the same amount just on the on the spot market, which is to say instantaneously. They have a need and they want to buy it from Russia. Russia has not been doing anything to help Europe. So Europe has a gas crunch right now. Energy prices are extremely high. The price of gas is something like 8 times where it was about a year ago. And a normal company behaving under normal market circumstances would be delighted to sell more energy, to sell its product to eager buyers. That's not what's happening right now. Russia isn't selling any extra, so it's kind of artificially created this shortage in Europe. But there's no military reason that should be the case right now. There are concerns that if tensions if conflict breaks out in Ukraine, if Russia further invades, if it goes beyond where it's already placed its troops on Ukrainian territory, that there could be a threat to Russian gas supplies that are flowing through Ukraine. And then there could be bigger problems for Europe.
Read the story from Washington Post climate solutions reporter Michael Birnbaum about this EU strategy to be unveiled next week at WashingtonPost.com. Follow him on Twitter at Michael Birnbaum. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
As mentioned in that interview, President Biden has warned the American people that should Russia invade Ukraine further, energy prices could be going up worldwide. That could hit Americans' pocketbooks. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki asked for some more details today during her daily briefing.
A lot of focus on the economic pain in Russia potentially from these sanctions, but what about the economic pain here? The Russians are saying they think gas prices in Europe are going to double. How high could they get here?
Well, I think, again, Peter, and as I said to Weijia, some of this depends on what President Putin does. So as he is suggesting what the impact will be around the world, it's all based on what his actions are, just to be very clear about it. What the president is focused on and is working on is taking every step we can to communicate with, coordinate with, engage with big global suppliers around the world to minimize the impact on the energy markets.
But even without all this going on, gas in California is almost $5 a gallon. Should people across the country expect to see that kind of a number when they go to gas up their car? $5, $6?
Well, again, I think as you heard the president say last week, standing up for our values is not without cost. What we're trying to do is minimize that cost. So I don't have a prediction of it right now because we're trying to minimize the impact on the global energy markets.
The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. On Wall Street, the Dow down another 464 points, closing at the lowest level of 2022. NASDAQ down 344, S&P down 79. From Reuters, Ukraine appealed to the United Nations General Assembly on Wednesday to stop Russia's aggressive plans, while Russia said it could not ignore the blatant genocide of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. Also disparaged the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Guterres and the United States have dismissed Moscow's claims of genocide. At today's meeting representing the United States, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield.
In an emergency meeting Monday night, all but one member of the Security Council called for dialogue and diplomacy, which can only happen if Russia abandons its unprovoked further aggression toward Ukraine. Has Russia heeded these calls? No. Instead, it has responded with additional actions to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, including mass disinformation, which we just heard again today, cyber attacks, and efforts to create a false flag pretext, in addition to Russia's overwhelming military buildup of more than 150,000 troops near Ukraine's border. Russia's actions have only confirmed what we and other nations have been warning about. Other UN member states must recognize the threat before us all today, before it's too late. Colleagues, there's no middle ground here. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. History tells us that looking the other way is ultimately the more costly path. And we need only to look across the past decade for an indication of the path that Russia is taking. Since 2014, Russia has occupied Crimea following its illegal invasion and has been manufacturing and fueling ongoing military conflicts in eastern Ukraine. In recent years, including President Putin's remarks this week, Russian leaders have claimed that Ukraine is not a real country. They have questioned its right to exist. Russia's actions are an unprovoked violation of international law, of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and a direct contradiction of the Minsk agreements.
Linda Thomas Greenfield, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, at today's UN General Assembly meeting in New York dedicated to the situation with Russia and Ukraine. CBS says that a record number of speakers slated to speak. Also taking part, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, accusing Russia of violating international law by recognizing those rebel-held areas in eastern Ukraine as independent, and also by calling the military troops sent in peacekeepers, a term with a very special meaning to the United Nations.
The history of this conflict is complex, and at least two permanently opposing narratives. I know that their authors will never agree on what happened in the past. But in the present situation, one thing is clear. The decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the follow-up are violations of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And here in this hallowed hall, I must emphasize that this action is also inconsistent with the landmark resolution adopted by the General Assembly more than half a century ago. I refer to the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. This so-called Friendly Relations Declaration was adopted during the General Assembly session marking the 25th anniversary of the United Nations. And the Friendly Relations Declaration, which has been cited repeatedly by the International Court of Justice as representing international law, sets out several vital principles that are highly relevant to today's session. In particular, I would note the principle of sovereign equality of states and the affirmation that the territorial integrity and political independence of the state are inviolable. Other resolutions of the General Assembly are also fully behind the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the Minsk agreements approved by the Security Council and that I strongly supported from the beginning were surviving in an intensive care unit thanks to a number of life support devices. But now those devices have been disconnected. We must also be concerned about preserving the integrity of peacekeeping. The United Nations has a long and recognized experience deploying peacekeeping operations which only take place with the consent of the host country. Mr. President, it's time for restraint, reason, and de-escalation. There is no place for actions and statements that would take this dangerous situation over the abyss. It's time to establish a ceasefire and return to the path of dialogue and negotiations to save the people in Ukraine and beyond from the scourge of war.
Antonio Guterres is the United Nations Secretary General, speaking to the UN General Assembly at headquarters in New York City. Discussion all day focused on Russia and Ukraine. Associated Press writes, as the West sounded the alarm about the Kremlin ordering troops into eastern Ukraine and decried it as an invasion, Russian state media painted a completely different picture of Moscow coming to the rescue of war-torn areas tormented by Ukraine's aggression and bringing them peace. TV presenters hailed the historic day and professed the end of suffering for the residents of the breakaway regions. That from AP. 3 weeks ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin met Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing on the sidelines of the Winter Olympics, the two pledging cooperation, also calling in a joint statement on NATO to halt any expansion, a key demand of Putin. But as the situation with Ukraine becomes more serious, potentially more bloody, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul says the alliance between China and Russia may not last.
Putin seeks to undermine the liberal international order. I'm echoing what Angela said. He's very comfortable to be in a Hobbesian 19th century world, redrawing borders. He's already redrawn borders 3 times, everyone. 3 times. He's already gone to war 4 times, if you count Chechnya in 1999. He is very comfortable with the use of power that is not, that does not have a UN Security Council resolution giving it legitimacy. And I think he's very risky. He's gone to war 4 times, Chechnya 1999, Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, Syria 2015. I think he's on the brink of another major war. He thinks he's won all those wars. And by the way, there's empirical data to suggest he has. And I think that makes him a very risky actor who's willing to take risky actions to revise the international order in a way that it seems to me makes Xi Jinping uncomfortable. I'm a big sports fan. I'm a big football fan. It kind of reminds me, with Xi Jinping and Putin, it's like you want to win the Super Bowl, so you take a chance on some kind of wild actors like Antonio Brown. Let's bring him in. He's a troubled actor, but maybe he'll make our team better. Well, look at what this troubled actor is doing for Xi Jinping. And I think there's a fundamental divide between China that wants to reform the liberal international order and create pockets of order independent of that. And I think they're rather successful at that, versus Putin, who just wants to break it down. And I'm not sure that this can last. I think that, I think we need to think about, and I'll end on this, we're all in the pre-invasion way of thinking about the world right now. And I hope I'm wrong. Let's be clear. I don't know what Putin's going to do, and I don't think nobody else does. But let's start to think about some of the more worst case scenarios. Maybe this is a good place to kick around the second round. If there are tens of thousands of people being killed in the heart of Europe, is it going to be so easy for Xi Jinping to do, I love Evan's phrase, would you call it cakeism? Have your cakeism? I actually think it'll be much harder to do that than it was in 2014. I think and I think the Western world and President Biden is going to call on the world. Are you with this war or against it? And I think that will be much harder to play cakeism if it's a full-blown war, and especially if it has consequences beyond Ukraine, which I don't think is a zero probability.
Michael McFaul was U.S. Ambassador to Russia under President Obama, now at Stanford University's Institute for International Studies, its director, part of a panel discussion today looking at Russia and China. It was hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Washington Post has a story today that reads, the Justice Department is shuttering its controversial China initiative and replacing it with a broader strategy aimed at countering espionage, cyber attacks, and other threats posed by a range of countries. Assistant Attorney General Matthew Olson, who heads the department's National Security Division, said the move was spurred by a growing recognition that the initiative's name and approach unintentionally fueled a harmful perception that the program unjustly targeted ethnic Chinese for prosecution. Washington Today continues in a minute.
C-SPAN's new American President's website is your one-stop guide to our nation's commanders-in-chief, from George Washington to Joe Biden. Find short biographies, video resources, life facts, and rich images that tell the story of their lives and presidencies, all in one easy-to-browse C-SPAN website. Visit cspan.org/presidents to begin exploring this rich catalog of C-SPAN resources today.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. UPI story from this morning reads, modeled after the Freedom Convoy that disrupted a border crossing in Canada for several days this month, a group of American truckers is set to travel across the United States in an 11-day journey to protest COVID-19 restrictions beginning on the West Coast Wednesday. Organizers for the group, known as the People's Convoy, are planning to have 1,000 semi-truck drivers gathered in Adelanto, California on Wednesday for the start of the trek that will take them to Washington, D.C. Adelanto is about 65 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. One of the organizers speaking to the crowd before the trucks took off.
That's right. So first of all, well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lee Dundas. I'm a human rights attorney. Truckers for coming out to the great city of Adelanto, and all of you for coming out here to see them off today. This is an amazing thing. The People's Convoy is going to be a transcontinental journey, 100% peaceful and law-abiding, bringing a message of unity and freedom and various other things all across this great country. You know, the last 2 years have been really, really rough. A lot of people have died from COVID. And many more have died from the policies that were put in place to handle COVID. These policies initially said that some of us were non-essential, which is false, as you know. We are all, one and all, essential. And by the way, these policies have now said that you cannot go to work if you choose to have a different medical path or a different status than that of your neighbor. The result has been an absolute economic crippling, not just of our great economy and of our great country, but of small and medium-sized businesses everywhere, and indeed of you and me and all of the workers, including the truckers themselves. These categories, essential, non-essential, vaccinated, unvaccinated, liberal or progressive or conservative. These are distinctions that divide us. They don't unify us. And a few weeks ago, these truckers reached out and they said, you know what? We don't believe in these artificial distinctions. We don't believe in separating people based on their status or whatever medical path they chose or didn't choose. We don't believe in stopping international truckers and commerce and travel between borders just because somebody made a different decision medically than his or her neighbor.
A rally in Adelanto, California at the start of what is known as the People's Convoy, one of several truck convoys around the United States that are beginning to head towards Washington, D.C. Some of them promising not to enter the city itself, but to tie up traffic on roads surrounding Washington, including the Interstate Highway Loop, over 60 miles, known as the Beltway. Next Tuesday, March 1st, is President Biden's first State of the Union address, and today House Speaker Nancy Pelosi asked about those convoys and U.S. Capitol security.
State of the Union, you've had pretty unique security challenges through the last couple of State of the Unions, be it insurrection, COVID. This year there's talk of these trucker protests. Are you confident in the security of the Capitol ahead of the State of the Union this year?
Well, again, this is in the realm of the police. Of my understanding, when we arrived here last night, that the chief of police had called for the National Guard to be present leading up to and around the time of the State of the Union, that they have a good handle on what the expectation is. Some of it won't even come until after the State of the Union. But no, I feel confident. Now, I don't have, people said, oh, don't let them put up a fence. That's not my call. That's a security call, and that's the call of the sergeants at arms and the chief of police.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi today at a news conference. The U.S. Capitol Police and District of Columbia Metropolitan Police and Emergency Management Agency have gotten approval of their request to the Pentagon for deployment of 700 National Guard troops to help with traffic control as those truck convoys arrive in D.C. in the coming days. 400 of the Guard members coming from the D.C. National Guard and the 300 from other states. Pentagon saying the Guard members will not carry firearms or take part in law enforcement or domestic surveillance activities. More from today's Pentagon briefing with Press Secretary John Kirby.
I think you may have seen that the Secretary did approve a couple of requests for National Guard support here in the Capital Region. He approved that request yesterday. Those requests came from the D.C. government, their emergency management agency, as well as the U.S. Capitol Police. All told, among the two requests, it's about 700 Guards personnel and about 50 vehicles. They are designed for traffic support in anticipation of potential challenges to traffic here in the D.C. area surrounding some potential protest activity. I want to stress again that it's a relatively small number here, about 700, and they will be supporting traffic support needs. That's their goal. That's their mission.
The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby at his briefing. Those trucker convoys heading to Washington protesting COVID-19 restriction policies, including mandatory vaccinations and mask wearing, but also some of the organizations saying that they're protesting inflation and high energy prices as well. Dr. Tom Frieden was director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention under President Obama, and he said today that from his perspective, the U.S. is in pretty decent shape when it comes to handling the coronavirus pandemic.
What's certain is that we are better prepared than ever to deal with this virus. We have more immunity, more vaccines, more treatments, better understanding of masking and ventilation, more tests, more surveillance, more genomic surveillance, more wastewater surveillance, more awareness. So we are better able to deal with what COVID may throw at us. That's certain. What's likely? I think we will have a much brighter 2022. I think we're going to have a year in which we put the most disruptive aspects of this pandemic behind us. We'll still be dealing with people with long COVID. We'll still be dealing with cases and clusters and hospitalizations and tragically with deaths. But I do think that 2022 is the year in which we stop having this virus dominate our lives to the extent that it has in the past. But I'll tell you what's uncertain, and this is what concerns me most. What's uncertain, first, is we don't know what the virus is going to do next. The virus is adapting to people. We need to adapt to the virus. We don't know what future variants will hold, nor do we know how long immunity will last, nor do we know really optimal vaccine scheduling and series. We're going to learn that with time. But most importantly, what we don't know is whether or not we will seize the moment. We will seize the moment to strengthen public health in this country, to strengthen global public health capacity so that we can achieve something like the goal of 717, where every single outbreak is identified within 7 days, reported in 1, and control measures established within 7. That's what's in the balance for 2022, and it's really in our hands. There has never been such a teachable moment. There has never been an opportunity to make the kind of progress we have today, the opportunity to making our world safer and healthier. So 2022 is really decision time for whether or not the world becomes a safer, healthier place.
Dr. Tom Frieden, former CDC director under President Obama, is now president and CEO of Resolve to Save Lives. Discussion about pandemic preparedness today, hosted by the Bipartisan Policy Center. New York Times has a story that 2 doses of a new COVID vaccine that is based on a conventional approach achieved 100% efficiency against severe disease and hospitalization, and it could be an effective booster after other COVID shots, the vaccine's manufacturers announced today. The vaccine is made by Europe-based pharmaceutical companies Sanofi and GSK. It's one of 4 candidates that received billions of dollars for development from Operation Warp Speed, the Trump administration's program to accelerate vaccines. U.S. Supreme Court hearing a case today brought by a group of Republican state attorneys general who want to defend a Trump administration immigration restriction that the Biden administration has rescinded and decided not to defend in court. The restriction is the public charge rule. It's from 2019. It changes the way the U.S. could turn away immigrants who are likely to use certain public benefits like Medicaid, food stamps, and housing assistance. Here's part of today's oral argument in the case Arizona v. San Francisco. Justice Clarence Thomas questioning Arizona Attorney General Mark Brovanovich.
What makes this case different from any other case? I mean, when administrations change, I think this is my 5th administration change, and the new administration often changes its position in cases. So what's different from this case in which the administration declines to appeal an adverse ruling?
Justice Thomas, this was an unprecedented legal maneuver. What the Department of Justice did here when the administration changed is literally not only dropped an appeal when this very court had granted certiorari, but then simultaneously dismissed 4 other appeals in the circuit courts that were pending before the circuit courts, left in place one judgment in the Northern District of Illinois, and then used that district court decision to rescind a rule without going through the proper notice and rule commenting. And so it is really unprecedented. Frankly, I'm not aware of any other precedent where you have this types of maneuvers.
Mark Brovanovich is Arizona Attorney General, Republican, before the U.S. Supreme Court, questioned by Justice Clarence Thomas. Arguing on behalf of the federal government, the Deputy Solicitor General Brian Fletcher.
The 2019 public charge rule did not regulate or confer any rights on the petitioner states. Instead, petitioners assert an indirect economic interest in the rule's downstream consequences. Relying on predictions that were made when the rule was drafted, they say that it would cause DHS to deny adjustment of status to people who would be more likely to use state-funded public benefits at some point in the future. But we now know that those predictions were wrong. During the year that the 2019 rule was in effect, we know that it affected only about 5 of the approximately 50,000 adjustment of status applications to which it was applied, or about 1/100th of 1%. The states do not have a legally protectable interest in preserving that negligible indirect effect, and even if it did, they could not justify intervention in appeals from preliminary injunctions that do not apply in petitioners' jurisdictions and that now have no effect anywhere because the 2019 rule has been vacated in a separate final judgment.
U.S. Deputy Solicitor General Brian Fletcher, part of his opening statement before the Supreme Court justices asked their questions. Today's case, Arizona v. the county and city of San Francisco. Bloomberg Law has a readout on how the case may turn out. It writes, Supreme Court Justice appeared annoyed with how the Biden administration rescinded a hot-button Trump-era immigration policy and wrestled with the tangled legal aftermath and what to do about it. Concern crossed traditional ideological lines at argument on Wednesday over handling of the so-called public charge rule and the current administration's move to block Republican-led states from defending it in court after deciding not to while it drafts a new regulation. We covered this, and you can find the oral argument in its entirety at our website, cspan.org. And thank you for listening to Washington Today. Get more top Washington stories each day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day, and we discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Thursday morning, Anatol Levin of the Quincy Institute discusses the latest developments in the ongoing crisis between Russia and Ukraine. And Washington Post columnist Henry Olsen previews the Conservative Political Action Conference this week in Orlando and looks at the future of the Republican Party. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Thursday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, texts, and tweets.